Chapter 15 of the Life of Saint Teresa. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Life of Saint Teresa by Teresa of Jesus. Translated by the Reverend John Dalton. Chapter 15. She continues the same subject, and gives some advice how persons are to act in the prayer of quiet, etc. Let us now return to our subject. This quiet and recollection of the soul are easily perceived, by the peace and satisfaction they produce, together with a very great pleasure and calm, as well as the sweetest delight in the soul. And now it seems to her, as she has not arrived any further, that already there is nothing for her to desire, and that she may willingly exclaim with St. Peter, "Lord, it is good for us to be here." She dare not stir, nor move, lest the good should depart from her. Sometimes she would even desire not to draw her breath. The poor soul understands not, that as by herself she is unable to do anything towards bringing this good to her, so she has less power to keep it any longer than our Lord is pleased. I have already mentioned how in this quiet and recollection the powers of the soul are not wanting, but she is so fully satisfied with God, that though while the prayer lasts the memory and the understanding are not exempt from distractions, yet, as the will remains united with God, the soul does not lose her quiet and calm, but rather, by little and little she recalls the other two powers, so as to make them recollected. And though the will be not wholly engulfed in God, yet she is so occupied, without knowing how, that however diligent these two may be, they cannot deprive her of her contentment and joy, but rather, she goes on helping herself without any trouble, in order that this little spark of God's love may not be extinguished in her. I beseech His Majesty to grant me grace, that I may make this point well understood, for there are many souls who arrive at this degree of prayer, and few who go beyond it, and I know not who is in fault. But of this I am sure, there is none on the part of God. For since His Majesty does a soul the favour of bringing her to this degree, I cannot believe He would cease to bestow many more favours upon her, were it not through some fault of her own. It is very necessary for the soul who has arrived so far, to understand the great dignity she possesses, and the great favour our Lord has bestowed upon her, and what powerful reasons she now has no longer to belong to this earth, because it seems that His goodness has already made her an inhabitant of heaven, if she lose it not through her own fault. Wretched will she be if she turn back, for I believe she would descend very low, just as I was doing, if the mercy of our Lord had not brought me back again, because for the most part such a misery is, in my opinion, to be attributed to grievous faults. Nor is it possible to fall from so great a good, without great blindness to such an evil. I therefore beseech those souls, for the love of our Lord, on whom His Majesty has bestowed such favours as to enable them to attain this state, to know themselves, to estimate such a favour as it deserves, and to resolve, with humility and holy presumption, not to return to the flesh-pots of Egypt, but if, through their weakness and wickedness, and their miserable and corrupt nature, they should fall again, as I did, let them always be representing to themselves the good they have lost. Let them suspect themselves, and walk with fear, for they have reason to do so. If they return not to prayer, they will go on from bad to worse. For this I call a real fall, when a soul abhors that very means by which she purchased so great a good, and it is to such souls I am speaking now. I say not that they will never offend God, or fall into sin, though it is but reasonable that those souls who have begun to receive these favours should guard against falling as much as possible. But we are miserable creatures, and what I earnestly advise is, not to omit prayer, for thereby we shall know what we are doing, and we shall obtain true sorrow for having offended our Lord, and strengthen to rise again when we have fallen. Let us be convinced, that if the soul neglect prayer, she exposes herself, in my opinion, to great danger. I know not if I understand what I am saying, because I judge of others by myself. This kind of prayer, then, is a spark of God's true love, which our Lord begins to enkindle in the soul. And His desire is, that she should understand what is the nature of this love, and what kind of delight it brings with it. This quiet, and recollection, and little spark, if it come from the Spirit of God, and be not a pleasure either given by the devil or procured by ourselves, however small it may be, makes a great noise. And if the soul do not extinguish it by her own fault, this it is which begins to enkindle a large fire, which, as I shall mention in the proper place, sends forth from itself flames of the most burning love of God, which His Majesty is pleased perfect souls should enjoy, though he who has experience cannot but immediately understand that it is a thing which cannot be acquired, but that as our nature is so desirous of pleasure, we wish to taste of everything. If, however, this quiet and recollection comes from the devil, we soon grow very cold again, and however much we may desire to make the fire burn, in order to obtain this pleasure, it seems that we need only cast water on it to quench it. This spark is a sign or pledge which God gives to that soul, to show her how He chooses her for great things, if she will only make herself fit to receive them. This is an invaluable gift, much greater than I am able to express. Deeply am I grieved, because, as I was saying, I know many souls who have arrived so far, and yet so very few have passed further on, as they ought to do, that I am ashamed to acknowledge it. There may, however, be many, for God supports us for some purpose, but I only speak of those I have seen. I would earnestly advise such not to hide their talent, for it seems God chooses them, that they may do good to many other souls, and especially in these times when it is so necessary for His Majesty to have staunch and resolute friends to support the weak. And let all who find they have received this favor esteem themselves strong, if they know how to correspond with the Lord, which even in this world a sincere friendship requires. And if not, let them fear lest they do themselves some harm, and God grant that the evil may come upon no one but themselves. In this prayer of quiet, the soul has nothing more to do than to remain enjoying her sweetness without making any noise. I call it noise, if the understanding go about seeking many words and considerations, to give thanks for this benefit, and be collecting together her sins and imperfections, in order to discover she does not deserve this favor. All is in motion now. The understanding represents many things to us, and the memory is busy. And truly these powers of the soul give me at times some trouble, and as I have a weak memory too, I cannot control them. At this time, then, the will should remain in repose, and wisely acknowledge that this is not the way to treat with God, and it is like throwing great logs of wood, without discretion, on a small spark, in order to extinguish it. Let her therefore acknowledge with humility, and say, "O Lord, what can I do here? What has this slave to do with the Lord of heaven and earth?" Or she may use some other loving words, such as present themselves, being firmly convinced, however, that what she says be the truth. As regards the understanding, let the soul consider it in no other light than that of a miller, as it were, and if she be desirous of giving it a part of what she enjoys, or shall labor to make it recollected, she will not gain her object, for often we see that in this union and repose of the will, the understanding is still much out of order, and if the will cannot arrest it, it is much better to let it alone, rather than go after it. Let it remain in the enjoyment of this favor, shut up in itself, like a wise bee. For if none of the bees should go into the hive, but be all wandering about, very little honey would be made. A soul will lose much, if she pay not attention to this point, especially if the understanding be subtle, for when once she begins to arrange her discourses, and to seek for reasons, she will think she has done something great, particularly if the discourses be eloquent. But the discourse which should be used in this prayer must be, clearly to see and acknowledge that there is no other reason why God should confer so great a favor on us than His own goodness, to consider that we are very near Him, to beg favors from His Majesty, to pray for the church. for those who have recommended themselves to our prayers, and for the souls in purgatory, and this should be done, not by the noise of words, but by feeling desire to be